Hello, my name is Chloe Newton. This is my second extra credit assignment for ethical and legal issues, and I will begin with the critical incident of this ethical dilemma. A couple years ago, a 70-year-old man was found unconscious in Miami, Florida. Paramedics were called to the scene, and he was rushed to a hospital emergency room. He was by himself at the time that he was discovered. No family, no personal identification either with his belongings. His blood alcohol levels were very high, and tests showed that he had a lot of existing health conditions, including COPD, a heart arrhythmia, and diabetes mellitus. So in light of his declining health, the staff in the ER needed to give him CPR if he was to survive. However, the confounding factor in this situation and what spurred this ethical dilemma is that the patient had a tattoo on his chest which read, "Do not," the not was underlined, "resuscitate," and then what appeared to be a signature. And it was placed right where the paddles would be placed for right where hands would pulse for CPR. So since this guy didn't have any family with him, next of kin was not able to be contacted. They had no personal information on him. The staff was presented with a decision of, do we help the patient regain consciousness, or do we honor the patient's tattoo? So after failing to help him regain consciousness, so that they could talk to him and ask him, what is your current stance on, what would you like to do? The staff became conflicted and they requested help from ethics consultants. So the ethics consult came to the conclusion that the ER staff should honor the patient's tattoo, even if a written DNR request didn't uphold the man's current wishes. So the hospital staff later found the patient's written DNR request, and then they were able to let him pass away in the night because of his deteriorating health. So the first ethical principle I think of in this situation is respect for the patient's autonomy. So even though his written DNR wasn't initially found at the time of him being brought to the hospital, the ethics committee believed that the tattoo was a good enough reason, that it was a good enough, authentic request of the patient's. So when they did discover his written DNR request, this upheld the fact that the patient's autonomy was to be respected. If the doctors performed CPR and resuscitated the patient, his personal wishes would have been violated, and his autonomy violated as well. So the next ethical principle in this situation is beneficence. The hospital staff looked after the patient with an initial decision not to honor the DNR tattoo. They reasoned that this type of decision shouldn't be made with so much uncertainty in the situation because the possibility of the DNR holding true led to the involvement of an ethics consultation. So the staff learned more on the angle that the tattoo could have been a regrettable decision, since literature on the subject showed a case of a DNR tattoo not reflecting a patient's current wishes, and that's why they wanted to proceed with the resuscitation in case the tattoo wasn't what he currently wanted. This, however, raised the question of what the patient's best interest would be, which displays non-maleficence. If the staff decided not to care for the patient and to let him pass on his own, then they would be avoiding any unnecessary harm. This unnecessary harm could stem from recovering the patient from his incident, which could cause emotional or psychological trauma. So, historical context and stakeholders of this situation. So, as previously mentioned, the unidentified patient had existing health conditions that hindered his ability to get better from this incident, even to just regain his consciousness to talk to him about what path he would like to take. So the fact that he had these existing health conditions gave the hospital staff less time to come to a sound decision on how to treat the patient. So the stakeholders in the situation are, of course, the 70-year-old man, the emergency room staff, The social work department, who was in charge of finding the patient's next of kin and his DNR request, if there was any, which there was, the ethics consultants, who then prompted the hospital ER staff to honor the man's tattoo. The psychosocial context that I found was involved was whether the medical community would have agreed to the staff's decision to or to not honor the man's tattoo, and this could potentially risk the reputation of the staff and the hospital on making an impulsive decision. And then there's also a psychological impact that can be placed on the man had he been resuscitated, since that was not his current wish. So organizational and legal concepts. So although the staff initially did decide to not honor the patient's tattoo, the ethics consultants advised them to follow through with the request, even if documentation couldn't be found. They said that the tattoo was most likely an authentic request rather than a regrettable decision in the past. And they also told the hospital ER staff that the law is not always going to support medical professionals' decision to care for the patient's best interests, because if the in the situation, the patient's best interests were to not be resuscitated. So if the hospital staff had done that, then the law might not back them up, even though that would, in their eyes, be beneficence, do all good for patients. So since the social work department was able to find the DNR request, the patient's best interests were upheld. But had the staff decided to avoid the tattoo, which isn't an illegal action, but the patient could have placed a lawsuit on the hospital and staff involved. So the case resolutions I came up with two. The first one would be the hospital decides not to honor the patient's tattoo because they don't want to invoke a principle of not choosing an irreversible path when faced with uncertainty. Some pros to this would be they'd be displaying beneficence for their patient. Another pro would be that the patient might be thankful and they might think that they deserve a second shot at living. Cons, however, is that the patient doesn't feel this way, sues the hospital and the involved staff. The hospital staff could be charged with assault, and there would be a risk of hospital reputation. And then, of course, the other case resolution would be that the hospital decides to honor the patient's tattoo, which is a presumed advance directive, and then no resuscitation would happen. A pro would be that the patient's autonomy is respected for his end-of-life wishes. Another pro would be non-maleficence. They wouldn't be using any more means of medical attention to potentially cause him harm. A con of this is if the patient didn't have a written DNR, then his family could potentially sue if they thought, he should have still lived. Another con is that the tattoo might not have expressed the patient's current wishes, since literature on the subject did show that there were patients in the past who had DNR tattoos, but those did not reflect their current end-of-life wishes. So based on these two resolutions, I believe that the second one would be the best outcome. That would be in deciding to honor the patient's tattoo. I feel like if somebody goes to that extreme to voice their end-of-life wishes, it should be looked at as authentic. So although the tattoo did present confusion to the staff and the concern of its legality, it does seem plausible that the request should be upheld, and that's what the patient would want. Also, the patient had the tattoo had the patient's signature, which was also pretty significant. And this is why I believe that the tattoo gave every reason to infer that it was not meant to mislead others, but to guide others in this situation. All right, that is all for me today. Thank you.